This is a video about Octavia Butler's short story Bloodchild, which comes from her collection of short stories called Bloodchild and Other Stories. And that collection was published in 1995. Butler won the Hugo Award and the Nebula Award for this collection of short stories. And for this video, I'm going to focus on just a couple of underlying questions, and then I'm going to talk about the end of the story and how answering these questions and looking at the beginning of the story can help us understand Gon's choice at the end, or if we even want to call it a choice. So, what is familiar and what is unfamiliar? When we begin the story, it can be very disorienting, right? Right off the bat, we are introduced to a new world. We are introduced to a world in which humans, in some ways, are dehumanized, but they're also valued. They're involved in interspecies relationships. Time works a little bit differently. So, there's a lot that's disorienting and confusing. But on the other hand, there are certain patterns and tropes that might feel very familiar. After all, you can see this as a coming-of-age story, as bizarre as it may seem, as sci-fi as it may seem. Ultimately, it is a coming-of-age story about how somebody deals with a disturbing truth and then makes a choice. Again, choice is a kind of a complicated word here because to some readers, Gon doesn't really have a choice and doesn't really give consent. I also want to think about why the story begins with the healing and narcotic powers of the eggs. So the story, of course, centers around these eggs that must be implanted into a Terran, which is a human being, preferably in this society a human boy, but they can also be planted into a human girl. And there's this weird relationship between the Terrans, the humans, who have moved to this new planet, and the natives to this planet, these large centipede-like creatures who need a warm body to implant their eggs in. Those creatures are called the Tlick. So why does the story begin with the healing powers of eggs? We know that these eggs and the creatures inside of them do horrifying things, and there's a downside to being implanted with these eggs, but Butler makes a choice to begin with describing the eggs in kind of a positive light. Let's take a look at the first paragraph. My last night of childhood began with a visit home. Tigatoy's sister had given us 2 sterile eggs. Tigatoy gave one to my mother, brother, and sisters. She insisted that I eat the other one alone. It didn't matter. There was still enough to leave everyone feeling good. Almost everyone. My mother wouldn't take any. She sat watching everyone, drifting and dreaming without her. Most of the time, she watched me. So, of course, this discussion of the eggs that make people feel good, it's almost like it could be some sort of alcoholic beverage or some sort of drug, right? Or just like it's some sort of family dinner. So there are things that feel familiar. Someone who is coming of age is returning home and they're eating together and families are hanging out together. But these eggs are like no eggs that we've been introduced to. They're not like chicken eggs. These eggs have these medicinal properties. We learn later on, or just a paragraph later, that the eggs can extend somebody's life. They can smooth wrinkles. They can put you into this altered state. The eggs and the sting from these creatures, these centipede-like creatures, the Tlick, can relieve pain. So there are all of these almost mystical qualities to these eggs. Okay, I also want to focus in on my last night of childhood began with a visit home. That's sort of counterintuitive, right? You would think that your last night of childhood begins with you leaving home, but here it begins with a visit home. So it feels familiar, but also unfamiliar. It's a coming of age story about somebody transitioning or growing up or some sort of change taking place, some sort of ritual, right? We know that people are gathered together, or I shouldn't say people because we're dealing with 2 species, but that this world is kind of flipped upside down, that some things are going to be a little bit different. So we have certain expectations, but those expectations are also subverted. This story could be considered a Bildungsroman story. So Bildungsroman means a novel of education in German. And we've read Bildungsroman stories many times. I'm sure you've read several stories and seen several films that deal with a young person coming of age and undergoing some sort of educational or spiritual transformation. Often these stories begin with some sort of tragedy or big decision or something really formative that shapes the young person and moves them across cross the threshold from being a child to being an adult. So this has a lot of the trappings of a Bildungsroman, a coming of age story, and yet it feels a little bit different. It feels very foreign. I lay against Tiga Toy's long velvet underside, sipping from my egg now and then, wondering why my mother denied herself such a harmless pleasure. Less of her hair would be gray if she indulged now and then. The eggs prolonged life, prolonged vigor. My father, who had never refused one in his life, had lived more than twice as long as he should have. And toward the end of his life, when he should have been slowing down, he had married my mother and fathered 4 children. So again, there are certain things that feel familiar, right? A mom not wanting to partake in some sort of pleasure, like drinking or eating too much, right? Not wanting to indulge. But then we realize that what she's not wanting to indulge in is this egg. Now, maybe this is her form of rebellion, right? She can't completely rebel. After all, she grew up with Tiga Toy, even though Gon's mother is a human and Tiga Toy is this centipede-esque creature from this planet. And even though Tiga Toy has a lot of power over the preserve and her family is an important political family, they did grow up together. They're different ages, but they had this adolescent period together, which is really interesting, right? Because even though they're different ages and different species, time works so differently here that somehow they were able to experience their formative years together. So they have this connection, and yet we can sense that Gon's mother is hesitant to give up Gon. Remember, Gon, his role, he has been chosen to be implanted with Tiga Toy's eggs. The eggs will then be hatched out of Gon in this, what we learned later, can be a really violent and brutal and life-threatening experience. If the eggs chew through the body fast enough, if the Talik person or the Talik creature is not there to make sure everything goes well and to put the eggs in some sort of warm vessel like another animal, it could go horribly wrong for the human carrier, the human surrogate. We also learn, like I said, that time and aging are working in weird ways. So Gon's father was able to prolong his life, and he was able, when he was supposed to be old, to marry Gon's mother. And oftentimes when we have a big age difference, we can start thinking about questions of power dynamics and power structures. We're going to see a big age difference and a big power differential between Gon and Tiga Toy, whether we see Tiga Toy as kind of a maternal figure or a romantic partner or a sexual partner. There is a big power differential. After all, Tiga Toy is this large, powerful centipede creature, and Gon is a relatively young man. We don't know exactly how old he is, but we know that he's relatively young, right? He's in sort of a transformational period, so he's probably an adolescent or a very young man. I also think it's just really compelling how Butler describes the experience of being encaged inside Tiga Toy's arms, her multiple arms, as being encaged. She describes that a little bit later. But here, her underside is long and velvet, and Gon is sipping from the egg and wondering why his mom can't just sip from the egg and clear her wrinkles and live a little bit longer and enjoy herself. So even though Tiga Toy is powerful and authoritative. In fact, she even abuses or hits Gon at one point in the story. There's also kind of this soft and loving relationship, and Gon seems to want to be close to her sometimes, right? Other times he seems afraid of her. So it's hard to figure out right off the bat exactly what their relationship is. That's because we don't really have, at least in my view, equivalent relationship patterns that we see here on Earth. This is a strange symbiotic relationship between species, or at least that's how the story goes, and that's how they justify having the preserve. But my mother seemed content to age before she had to. I saw her turn away as several of Tiga Toy's limbs secured me closer. Again, Butler doesn't just say this creature was a giant centipede. She drops in these hints from the beginning, like long velvet underside or several limbs, and we slowly become awake to the fact that we're dealing with a species that is not human. Toy liked our body heat and took advantage of it whenever she could. When I was little and at home more, my mother used to try to tell me how to behave with Toy, how to be respectful and always obedient, because Toy was the Tlick government official in charge of the preserve, and thus the most important of her kind to deal directly with Terrans or humans. It was an honor, my mother said, that such a person had chosen to come into this family. My mother was at her most formal and severe when she was lying. So you know from reading the story that the preserve was set up as a new system that was supposed to benefit both the Tlick, the native inhabitants of this planet, and the Terrans, the humans who have moved to this planet to escape Earth. Before this arrangement happened, the Tlick were using humans basically like livestock, as breeders, basically like cattle. With this arrangement, there is a preserve. The Terrans or the humans are protected and their families are connected. So each family gives a child or chooses a child to be the one who is implanted when they get old enough. So it's supposed to be this much more humane or loving symbiotic relationship. But I think if we look at that word preserve, right, there's a lot to unpack. So on the one hand, they live in this preserve that keeps them safe from the hordes of Tlick outside who don't really see them as human beings, or they just see them as warm bodies and that's it. They're being kept safe. But on the other hand, there are a lot of rules and regulations. They can't have guns. They don't have complete autonomy. Not that having a gun means that you're autonomous, of course. And you're forced, if you're chosen, to be implanted with eggs. Of course, we might say that Gon has a choice at the end, but he doesn't have many choices. He can kill himself, or he can allow his sister to be impregnated with the eggs, and the sister actually wants to be impregnated with the eggs. So again, I'm using this word choice, but I don't know if we can really call it choice. It's more complicated than that. My mother was at her most formal and severe when she was lying. So even though this arrangement, this bizarre symbiotic relationship on the preserve seems so foreign and so strange, I think a mother sort of saying these truisms or saying something that she doesn't really believe about honor and dignity and respect and proper behavior, but she's kind of lying about it, is very relatable, right? So there's something very human about that at the same time as we're talking about something that is totally bizarre and foreign to us. I want to skip down a little bit further. She came in, this is Toy. She simply came in, climbed onto one of her special couches, and called me over to keep her warm. It was impossible to be formal with her while lying against her and hearing her complain as usual that I was too skinny. "You're better," she said this time, probing me with 6 or 7 of her limbs. "You're gaining weight finally. Thinness is dangerous." The probing changed subtly to become a series of caresses. Okay, so I think this line really encapsulates the whole kind of tension of the story. Probing changed to a series of caresses. Is this a probing? Is this a forced implantation of eggs? Or is this a loving relationship? Is this a love story? Or is this a story about slavery? Now I'm going to skip to back to the top for a second. For Bloodchild and other stories, Butler has left afterward. So for each story, there's an afterword in which she talks a little bit about her process or what she was thinking. Generally, when we read short stories, we try to steer clear of focusing too much on what the author has said about his or her own work, and we want to focus on just what the text itself says. But because Butler's afterword appears right after the story, it's sort of weird not to at least think about what she had to say about her own story. Most critics now try to avoid the intentional fallacy or the authorial intent fallacy, where you focus too much on the author as expert, but some critics like to bring in the author and think about what the author was trying to say as opposed to just what the text actually says, right? There's kind of a difference. But in her afterword, Butler says that she's really surprised that so many people see this story as a story about slavery. And she said the story is about other things. It's about what would happen if humans had to go to some other planet, but it didn't look like Star Trek, didn't look like the British Empire. Instead, some other arrangement had to be brokered. How would we pay rent, so to speak, on this other planet? She also said that it's her male pregnancy story, right? We know that Gon is a boy, and that that even though girls can be impregnated in this society, generally it's the male children once they come of age. So it's her male pregnancy story, she says. She also says that she wrote this because she was obsessed with this idea of the botfly. She was traveling to the Amazon in Peru, and she had read about the botfly and how actually the safest course of action if you are infested with botfly larvae is to not do anything, which is very counterintuitive. So Butler, and she also says that it's kind of a love story, a complicated love story. So that fine line between probing and caressing makes us think of the end of the story. Is this a parasitic relationship? Are the humans on this planet, the Terrans like Gon, are they being exploited? Are they enslaved in some ways? Or is this a relationship that's symbiotic, that even though it's imperfect and bizarre and strange, it's mutually beneficial? Both species and both creatures benefit, even though I would argue that one has to sacrifice more. Or does it go beyond that? Is it a love story? And if so, what kind of love story is this? What kind of love are we dealing with here? Is it maternal love or romantic love or some sort of love of duty? What kind of love story is this? Or is it kind of all three at once? Is it forcing us to question those fine lines? A few more things before we move on to the very end of the story. I love this part about how Tiga Toy lifts her head and moves a meter of her body off the couch. That's really kind of shocking and frightening, and I think is a reminder that she is incredibly powerful. She is physically bigger and faster than these humans. I love also later the description of Gon talking about her moving in kind of this aquatic way. She has so many legs moving so quickly that it's almost as if she's an aquatic creature, and he is sort of intrigued by that, but as readers we might be kind of repulsed by it. It's something that kind of makes us stretch our imaginations or our thinking about what can be beautiful and what can be powerful. After all, when I think of a centipede or an insect like a centipede, I think of something tiny that can be squashed, and yet these creatures are large and powerful, and they are the ones in control. I also think it makes us think a little bit about just what we accept as the natural arrangement of things, right? On planet Earth, we just sort of accept that humans are naturally the ones in charge and that animals are subservient to us. I think the reference to Gon having to kill another animal with his own hands and bring it in as a host animal so they can take the eggs out of Lomas and put them into some other creature so that the eggs can chew through that other creature is sort of a reminder of this idea of whatever creature is on top or at the top of the food chain or the top of the hierarchy, that might be kind of arbitrary, that it might seem natural, but to the creature who is on the bottom, it might seem very oppressive and deadly. I think it's noteworthy too how Tiga Toy and Gon's mother, Lean, have this really weird relationship because they grew up together. They're really close friends in a way, despite the age difference. But Gon's mother has to give up her son to this to this female centipede creature, to this female Tlick. And Tiga Toy gives her commands, but they're polite commands. She says, Lean, I would like you to have what's left of Gon's egg. Then the mother says, the eggs are for my children. And Tiga Toy says, they are for the family. Please take it. Unwillingly obedient, my mother took it from me and put it into her mouth. So even though Tiga Toy is very polite, she's also forceful. But she's forceful about doing something that should be in Gon's mother's benefit. After all, taking the egg is going to make her feel better. We also sense that something is about to happen that maybe is going to be difficult or disturbing for Lean, for Gon's mother. So taking the egg might make her feel better. It'll also make her more youthful. And yet she's sort of resistant to it at first. Maybe this is her version of rebellion. And yet we know who's in charge here. It's Tiga Toy. I think that oxymoron or almost oxymoron of unwillingly obedient really gets at that idea of the two creatures, the two maternal figures are friends, and yet the power dynamic is really clear. Tiga Toy is the one in charge here. Let's look at one more passage before we go to the end, actually. Tiga Toy was hounded on the outside. Her people wanted more of us made available. Only she and her political faction stood between us and the hordes who did not understand why there was a preserve, why any Terran could not be courted, paid, drafted, in some way made available to them. Or they did understand, but in their desperation, they did not care. She parceled us out to the desperate and sold us to the rich and powerful for their political support. Thus, we were necessities, status symbols, and an independent people. So that gives us a lot of context. We start to understand the system and why the preserve, even though it's incredibly repressive and you're restricted to the preserve, why it's better than the alternative, right? We learn that from Gon's brother, who says there's nowhere to escape, right? All there is the preserve. If you leave the preserve, things will be even worse. Can the humans, can the Terrans be both necessities, status symbols, things that are parceled out and sold, paid, courted, drafted, but also an independent people? Are these terms compatible? To me, on the surface, I would say no, those don't seem compatible. I don't see how you can be an independent person, but also be treated like an animal. Let's talk about the end. So Tiga Toy implants her eggs into Gon, and Gon, in a sense, makes a choice. So, quote, "You were the one making the choices tonight, Gon. I made mine a long time ago," meaning her choice to pick Gon as the one who would be the vessel for her eggs. And she says that Gon made a choice tonight. Now, I have a hard time with that, right? Because Gon doesn't have a whole lot of options. One option is to shoot himself, right? Which that option is made very clear when he holds the gun up to his throat. Another option, which seems like the path of least resistance, is to let Tiga Toy implant the eggs in his sister. After all, his sister wants this job. She wants to be implanted with the eggs. But he maybe chooses to be implanted himself. But one of the reasons why I have kind of a problem with this is that we realize that, and it's pretty obvious, that Gon was afraid and says that he still is afraid. But I still am, as in afraid. I could admit that to her here now. So after this implantation, he can admit that he was afraid. But we also learned something really kind of strange here that I have a hard time with. As he leans into her cool, velvet, deceptively soft body, he says, "And keep you for myself. It was so. I didn't understand it, but it was so." So it's not totally fear then that motivates Gon to be implanted with the eggs. It's not totally a sense of duty or not wanting it to happen to his sister and sacrificing himself. He wants to keep Tiga Toy for himself. He feels some connection to her. So what is their relationship then? Is it an abuser relationship where Tiga Toy is abusive and she has all the power? Is it codependent in some sort of way? Is it loving and abusive at the same time? And is that even possible? I would argue no. What is their relationship and what is their connection? And what does this say about what's going to happen to Gon now? Some people say that there are really only 3 stories in literature. A stranger comes to town, a terrible truth is told, and someone goes on a journey. I would say this story kind of encapsulates all 3 of these stories. The big one, though, would be a terrible truth is told. Gon realizes how horrific and disturbing this process of birthing these eggs actually is, and realizes that his relationship to Tiga Toy is really complicated and that he is a vessel and maybe doesn't have a whole lot of choice ultimately. And like I said earlier, this is a coming of age story. Gon goes on a journey. Not really physically, he doesn't travel far in the story, but he develops into a young man. He not only is put through tests of having to kill an animal himself and then having to witness something incredibly brutal and horrific, these eggs being taken out of Lomas, and watching him go through that without his Tlick next to him. But he realizes something about himself and his relationship to Tiga Toy. He also makes some sort of choice, again, whether or not we view that as a choice. So he goes from being much more childlike, by his own admission at the very beginning of the story, to being an adult. Now, I don't know his exact age. It doesn't say in the story, but it is pretty clear that there's some sort of transformation that takes place. There's some sort of bargaining that takes place between Tiga Toy and Gon. And we know that now, even though he's not exactly becoming a parent, right? After all, he is just sort of a vessel. He is taking on this responsibility, and he's taking on this really major risk of having these eggs implanted inside him. So that gets back to some of the fundamental questions from the beginning of this video. Why is Butler simultaneously showing us these patterns that seem familiar, coming of age stories, the difficult lines between relationships, growing up and coming to terms with difficult realities? Why is she giving us all of these things that seem familiar, but in this package of something far off, something sci-fi, something distant, and also something to a lot of readers that feels really revolting, right? We're not really used to reading about relationships between species, especially relationships like this when the humans seem so dehumanized in so many ways. I see this as dystopian. A dystopia, as opposed to a utopia, is a bad or ill place, topos meaning place, where people lead dehumanized lives. I think you could argue pretty clearly that the Terran are dehumanized in many ways, but they're also valued, at least by the Tlick in the Preserve, or some of the Tlick in the Preserve. Certainly not all of them. Many of them would like to see them as chattel. So I think perhaps what Butler is doing is making us think about systems that we have in place in our own society, right? Sci-fi is often about remote, faraway worlds where the rules are totally different, and yet we can't help but think back to our own world. So when you think of the Preserve, you might think of other cages or enclosures that both protect people or animals, whatever it is, but also might be restricting their movement or hurting them or keeping them down in some ways. You might also think about power structures in terms of relationships between people. Think of age and gender, which she is really flipping around in this story because the most powerful figure is an older female centipede-like creature. And the young boy here is the one who seems much less I think good writers, whether they are sci-fi writers or realist writers, are able to take situations or take structures or even just take things that we take for granted, and they're able to make them seem foreign or strange or unfamiliar. There's actually a technical term for this. It's called defamiliarization, which comes from the formalist critics. And it's this technique that writers use, and I would say that all art does this, of taking something common and making it seem strange in order for us to rethink it, to rethink these power structures, to rethink gender dynamics, to rethink relationships between species on our own planet by looking at a case study of another planet.